It's taking a step back and saying, okay, it's AI in its whole, and there's different, it's never going to be only Gen AI or only machine learning of certain kind, predictive analytics, whatever we want to call it, right? Or whatever terms we've used in the past. It's really, how do you bring all of this together? And in certain instances, it's going to be generative AI. In certain instances, it's not. You could just go build something really well just based off of some rules and heuristics that you intuitively know.
The Digital Banking Podcast is powered by Typhon. Typhon is the creator of Infinia, a dramatically better digital banking platform for community financial institutions, as well as several platform-agnostic, revenue-generating point solutions. Our highly configurable platform and broad ecosystem of third-party partners ensure our entire suite is scalable and extensible to meet the needs of any FI. On our podcast, you will hear host Josh DeTar discuss today's most pressing financial technology topics with seasoned industry experts from every possible discipline.
You know, your podcast hasn't officially made it until there's ads in it. But this is one you're not going to want to skip past. And, well, if you do, feel free to hit that fast forward 15 seconds button twice. Ever wonder what gives me my energy and enthusiasm during these podcasts? You know, outside of my relentless desire to learn about, connect, share, and build up community FIs and their mission to support the communities they serve? It's coffee, and lots of it. Now, you want to know what's better than your regular old coffee? How about donating $5 to the Children's Miracle Network hospitals through Credit Unions for Kids every time you purchase high-quality, ethically sourced coffee that also provides living wages to coffee farmers? So if you want to listen to this episode with epic levels of caffeine-induced focus and help kids in need, head to javaforkids.org to learn more and buy a bag or 10. Thanks. Welcome to another episode of the Digital Banking Podcast. My guest today is Shekhar Vemuri, the SVP CTO of Analytics for EXL Analytics. Now, a direct quote from Shekhar: "Adversity is an opportunity." Now, that's a pretty loaded statement, but I think it has a lot of merit to it. We grow by being challenged. For Shekhar, putting himself in uncomfortable situations is a tool to force growth, change, and adaptation. What's that old saying? What doesn't kill you only makes you stronger, right? Well, apparently that works well for Shekhar. He said he's a total adrenaline junkie, and even jumping out of a plane was for him pretty anticlimactic, actually. Being up high gave him beautiful perspective and didn't really get exhilarating until the ground started to get a little closer. Hence why the next thing he wants to try is bungee jumping. This new adventure-seeking side of Shekhar's personality extends deep into his professional life as well. He refuses to be put in a box, wants to explore, try new things, and take risks. Having spanned the tech ecosystem on many fronts, as well as being on the entrepreneurial side of intersecting business, tech, and finance, Shekhar has a wide lens to view things from. As someone who is fascinated by space, and even at one point as a child had aspirations of being an astronaut, Shekhar is looking into the unknown, trying to solve problems, looking for opportunities in front of us. With the rate and velocity of technology change, especially around AI, and the movement from computers being pretty good at doing what we ask them to do, to actually knocking on the door of creativity and them actually being able to think for themselves, a lot like space, there's a lot we know and a lot we don't. Whether it's in the front of the line for a roller coaster, cooking, listening to the latest from Neil deGrasse Tyson, or taking a much needed pendulum swing to the other extreme and lazing on a beach and recharging, Shekhar is keeping things interesting. And I'm going to be honest, we can expect no less from him in today's episode. So Shekhar, thanks so much for joining me as a guest on the podcast.
Josh, pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It was kind of funny when I was talking to you, and I got to admit, right? Like, you talk to a really well-presented professional tech guy who's got, the resume to back this all up. And I asked you, like, what's your personality like? And you're like, oh, I'm an adrenaline junkie. Like, I would lob myself out of an airplane. I'm like, wait, what? Hold the phone. And I thought was even crazier was when you're like, oh yeah, no, actually, skydiving was pretty anticlimactic. I think that is kind of a good indicator of like you really are kind of trying to look for what's on the edge of things, right? Whether that's just in kind of the personal sense or the professional sense. But where did this like curiosity for adrenaline junkies start?
Well, it wasn't from day one for sure. So I think it really intersected with, as sometimes it takes a little while to kind of find your way from the perspective of like, or you do what you do, and then one day it kind of clicks when you see a direct link between what you do and the impact that it creates. And I think, I don't know, it's been a while, but 15, 16 plus years ago, I think that was the thing that kind of clicked in my head in terms of like, oh, I'm making a difference. I'm making an impact. It's not just the mechanics of doing something. It's really, especially with software, you can kind of, in the technology field, solve problems in fairly interesting ways and take different techniques and bring them together. So I think a few years ago, that's what happened. And ever since it was like, oh, I just can't have enough.
That's cool that you kind of found that correlation though between kind of that personal adrenaline junkie side and the professional and even just the like being a human on this planet kind of side of things. Where are the areas where I can kind of push the boundaries and have some fun, but it's also whether it's making a positive impact on my life or someone else's. Like it's impressive that you were able to kind of draw that correlation. So I want to talk to you about the buzzword, right? Like we drop it a little bit in the intro, and I'm going to be straight up. Like this is the reason why I wanted to have you as a guest on the podcast, because everybody's kind of talking about it, but I'm always really interested to see different people's perspectives, because I think when we throw out that AI term, right,
Mhm.
there's a lot of marketing hype and there's a lot of people that are talking about it, but it's the practical applications that are where the rubber really meets the road. And so I really enjoyed having the opportunity to have some guests with different perspectives on that. And I really have appreciated kind of some of your perspectives. So let's maybe just like level set all the way back to, what does generative AI mean to you? What's kind of the lens that you are applying to it? And then let's talk a little bit about how you see some of the use cases for it. And, you made kind of a comment to me that we put in the introduction for you that's computers used to be really good at just doing what we told them. Now they're starting to almost think for themselves, right? So what's that going to look like? So yeah, if you could maybe just outline for me a little bit of like, what does that all mean to you? What's your definition of the buzzword, I guess is my ask.
Great question. So where do we start? So first and foremost, just to get something out of the way, I mean, I always look at, as much as there's all this buzz about Gen AI, truly, I think it's taking a step back and saying, okay, it's AI in its whole, and there's different, it's never going to be only Gen AI or only machine learning of certain kind, predictive analytics, whatever we want to call it, right? Or whatever terms we've used in the past. It's really, how do you bring all of this together? And in certain instances, it's going to be generative AI. In certain instances, it's not. You could just go build something really well just based off of some rules and heuristics that you intuitively know. So just having said that, because, and part of the reason why I'm kind of setting up that stage is because, to your point, buzzwords, easy to get carried away, right? Even Gen AI, it's been in the works for a while. It's not something that, right? I mean, while of course the democratization of it, the ease of access, or you got to give credit to OpenAI and ChatGPT to just open it up to everybody. But it's been
No
in the
pun
works for a
intended, right?
while, and absolutely not. Maybe just a tad bit. But it's for anybody who's been in the space of language, NLP, language comprehension. the whole space of semantic, anything semantic, right? Semantic search, even. A lot of these techniques have been around for a while, but a few things have kind of all come together to create that watershed moment, right? So first and foremost, it's just like anything else. Great ideas sometimes linger around till somebody has the right tools to put, bring it to life. So the way I see that is it's definitely compute, right? Having because this, and we'll talk more about this through this conversation, but it's definitely compute hungry, right? So having that right compute, having that right amount of data, and then being able to bring the techniques, the algorithms, and the data, and now this compute to build something that previously was probably conceived but never really seen through. That's the paradigm shift that's probably happened over the last I would say 8 to 9 years, right? So it's been, while the foundations have been around for a while, 8 to 9 years are what I would put the real revolution attributed to that. And I go back to I missed one part. The other thing is also this thought process of applying engineering, right? Everything is an engineering thought process. So why do I say this? So Google, as you know, has been at the forefront of AI for a long time. Google Brain, they did tons of R&D. In fact, I don't think OpenAI included, the rest of the industry would be anywhere close to where it is without all the stuff that, Google research, but also more importantly, contributed back to the open source community. But even Google talks about how, as you know, translate.google.com, right? We all use it to translate between languages. For the longest time, it used to be like, there's a bunch of benchmarks where language translation is measured in comparison to a human. And for the longest time, it would come close, but not really consistently surpass a human's ability, right? And about 9 years ago, to somewhere in that 2015, 2016 timeframe, it flipped to started continuously surpassing human performance in those benchmarks. And that's when even Google said, so what changed, right? While of course there was advancement in the way things were done, advancement in the algorithms, the general research, but one of the key foundational aspect, in addition to the data and having the right hardware compute, was having this engineering mindset, right? So moving from the just thinking about the math of it all to just saying, hey, I'm gonna go engineer this, try out a bunch of iterations, see what works best, learn from it, and just keep on iterating over it crazily. So, and that's what kind of unleashed the improvement. So coming back to your question, while there's enough provenance over the last 8, 9 years, all of it, but, everybody's question is, okay, how does this impact two things in what I do in my day-to-day life? And of course, professionally, right? So generative AI, the way I see it, slightly different from a bunch of the other stuff that we've seen materialize or come up in the past. I think we're really, you alluded to this in the intro, we're going from where we just tell computers what to do and that's all they do, to what seems to be like at the beginnings, very, very early days, maybe Big Bang plus, once or 1 millionth of a second kind of time frame of how we are unlocking creativity, right? Of course, now all of this is still learned from every piece of content, every piece of art, every image, every video that we as humans have created. But I think the unleashing that slightly creative and generative aspect, which was always a challenge in the past, is truly where the paradigm shift's happening, right? But that's not just generative in nature, right? One of the other things that's also happened is comprehension, understanding conversations. And this is where we'll probably even take an example, something that we all associate both as a consumer of this and sometimes, as a builder, is, let's just take the example of, as much as people don't call in to get to any kind of support, as much as they used to before, but you still, call in occasionally. I try to do as much as I can via a, text message or via apps or whatever. But when you need a customer service agent, you need one. And when you call them, the ability to understand that conversation, the ability to comprehend what's going on. And this is, I'm not just talking about base sentiment analysis. Was Shekhar upset on the call, or was he happy? Was he, did he sound satisfied? All that. That's great input, but really understanding, okay, what's the crux of the problem here, right? What is the challenge that whoever's calling in is running into? And then how do you then kind of marry it or stitch it to the solutions that you already know of, right? As an enterprise or as a company provider delivering a product. Long has been the bane of customer service. The fact that I ask a question, somebody's going to be like, "Oh, let me just go search for what your problem is," and it will, and something will pop up. I'll kind of ask you, "Oh, is this what you're running into? Why don't you try this, try that?" Right? But a simple but very powerful capability of comprehending what I just said and then being able to marry it to the solutions that are already there in your knowledge base, and then suggesting this to back to the person who's on the hand taking my call, to the agent. It's that is the paradigm shift, right? It's You're not just doing basic search of what I just said, you're actually understanding. So I could be expressing my problem in 10 different ways, but still the way you articulate it, the way I articulate it, somebody may have incomplete information, somebody may have accent, all of it, but still leading towards the same solution. That's the power, right? Everybody's seen the generative aspects of this. Hey, I'm now able to create images. I don't know, maybe Josh, question to you. Do you use image generation tools for some of your blogs? Maybe you do. A bunch of content creators are doing that, right? So things that used to be extremely difficult are now almost like 5 seconds of a prompt, whether it's in ChatGPT or anywhere else, stability. It's just at your fingertips. So it's really a big, big change, something that we've not seen over the last 25 years.
Wow. I want to get a little bit more from you on this topic, because this is something I find really interesting. You were talking about we're in the 1 millisecond of after the Big Bang in terms of just how much we've accomplished with AI versus, I'm assuming, what you're extrapolating to be, the potential future or end state of it, right? But even before that, there's been stuff happening, and that's what I'd love to learn a little bit more about. I mean, I guess I'm fortunate enough to work around some people significantly more intelligent and more versed in this stuff than I am. And so, I've heard them talking about what's been happening in AI and ML and large language models over the period of time. But even for me, right? You kind of called it out. ChatGPT was probably the first true democratization of some of those tools. Because I would say that there are absolutely people within my circle that have been building and using those tools before ChatGPT. I can tell you I was not one of them at all. And now I use ChatGPT multiple times a day, every single day. Right. So there was absolutely the catalyst for that. All of a sudden became a tool that I could, as an idiot, apply my use cases to and have it help me solve. Right. And like you were saying, it kind of turned into like Google on steroids for me. Right.
Mhm.
I had to think about, I may not know what I'm trying to accomplish, but I know how to ask the question. And so I can create a decent prompt in ChatGPT or other similar tools now, right? And it kind of helped walk me through it. So I was able to do that and say, hey, I don't quite know what I need, but maybe I need an image that's something like this. It looks kind of like this and maybe this style. Or, hey, maybe I need a simple contract written up that makes sure that these 6 areas are taken care of with these specific specifications. Give me a good outline, right? Things like that. But like you were saying, I mean, this has been happening long before. So what was happening before? And why do you think now, and why do you think it was ChatGPT, did this all of a sudden become so mainstream?
Great. I actually happen to have a little bit of insight because while the term generative AI is probably still more recent, at least the widespread usage of it, right? But a lot of this has roots in NLP, natural language comprehension, that whole space, right? So over the years, let me take this example of a company. Yeah. So this is from 6 years ago, right? So there's this company, some of listeners may have used it to, that whole in a box trend. So especially after what's the Dollar Shave Club and everybody came up with the subscription models for blades and all of that.
Yeah.
But that also went into the fashion industry. So there's these companies like Stitch Fix and a bunch of others. So every month or whatever frequency you want, what they would do is they would send a box and you would just have like a few pairs of clothes in there, right? Shoes, accessories, a bunch of that. Now, why are we talking about this? Because what I found interesting when I just ran into this person online. He used to write a great blog. I can't remember the URL, but if I do, I'll bring it up. But ex, I think nuclear physicist, English major, who then went into technology.
Yeah, that's a totally
And
natural progression.
yeah, hey, you'll be surprised how many psychology and physics and English majors I saw at grad school. So there's something about that none of us seem to be able to figure out. But going back to the example I was giving, so he talked about how they use this, how did they come up with this personalization, right? Because the game is two things. It's how do you, in a digital context, almost provide a personal shopper experience. So the app or the website, all it took was like, hey, describe your mood, describe your style. In some instances, maybe even upload a couple of examples of certain clothes that you like or accessories, whatever, and describe them, right? A bit. So this was like in those days, one of those early representations of, hey, you're now starting to get into the realm where text and images and content in general was kind of, becoming fluid. Today, as you know, you can go from a prompt to an image and from an image to a bunch of text in like a few seconds, right? But back in the day, it was still not that easy. So, but coming back to that innovation that actually makes what I do so exciting, it's they used BERT and a few other libraries that Google and others techniques that they had open sourced to really build this first comprehension of text, comprehension of content, and even going back and forth between text and images, right? These same folks used technology from a different space, which was used to go index huge amounts of content, right? So so vector databases is something anybody who's been in this Gen AI space may have heard of.
Can you pause and
They've been
explain?
around for
Can you
yeah
pause and explain that just a little bit for me?
yeah, absolutely. So, but just before I do that, vector databases, some of the ones that have kind of shot through the roof in terms of usage, they have provenance from like 10 years ago, right? They've been around for 9 to 10 years. A couple of them, I think Pinecone's sometime 2010, 2012, something around that. So now, what's happening behind the scenes, right? Now, there's all this content on the internet. Going back to our, hey, what were the key ingredients that led to this watershed moment or, kind of exponential growth? Of course, tons and tons of content, which, hey, on the internet, whether it's blogs, whether it's reputed publishing houses, some of who may not be very happy with OpenAI, as you can see in the news and the print, but tons of content out there. But how do you, really understand it? In the past, it was like, okay, if you just typed in Shekhar Vemuri or something on Google or Yahoo search, whatever it was, you would just match that against, the websites, the pages, all of it, do essentially token to token comparison, right? The word to word, and find results, rank it in a certain way and send it back to you. But where the shift started happening is like, okay, that's great. But then English specifically is so ambiguous, right? In the way it works. Context is king. Without context, the same word, you don't know what it may mean or imply. Are you talking about an apple pie or geometry when you talk about pies? What exactly are you talking about? So, so what changed is, using techniques like vectorization, which all it's doing is it's even above my head, but in a simple way, it's just drawing out it's representing text on a multidimensional vector space, right? But to simplify it, the power of this, right? What happens is you can now do math on text. And the classic example here is this is like the hello world of vectors is it, people figured out that when they applied these algorithms and techniques, they could now say, hey, man might plus or king minus man equals queen minus woman, right? So it's almost like some by virtue of not just looking at keywords, by virtue of looking at all the content and knowing that the gender, typically man, male, whatever, is associated with king and queen is associated with woman, was a learning that came about. Right now, why is this important? Now, I'll go back to what I was saying. If you remember that example that I was giving you where I called into a call center, I had said 10 different people could use different ways of expressing the same thing, which probably has different meanings, but at its core, ultimately is referring to the same thing, right? So that's where the proximity, when you map this out on a vector space, let's just take a 2D vector space, right? So if you X and Y axis, what they found was in that space, man and king are very close to each other and woman and queen are close to each other, right? So similar concepts started clubbing together. And hence you could then say that, okay, if you were referring to pie and apple, very different places, you were probably talking about a recipe as opposed to talking about geometry or something else. So lots of, again, I think as much as November 23 or so was the watershed moment, but lot of work. I mean, all of this standing on the giants, standing on the shoulders of all the work that, including Google, sometimes it doesn't get enough credit for this. But a lot of these folks both did the research and also, most importantly, open sourced it for everybody else to build on top of.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm glad you kind of went down the path of talking about the whole king, man, queen, woman. So one of the things I've heard our CEO Siba talk about is just how these dimensions are getting so much deeper in their understanding and being able to match those things. And he uses, I think, a similar example of like, if you say a cat is very similar to a dog, you're like, well, I mean, I guess they're both animals. What is that relative to? And he's like, well, if you apply it, a cat is more similar to a dog than a tree. All you would need is one dimension to say how many legs do they have. The tree has none. Both the cat and the dog have 4, right? So by that one dimension alone, they are now closer together than a tree. And that's just one dimension. And now the number of dimensions that these AI models are getting to are exponentially greater. And you kind of alluded to this earlier, that the change of pace for that is also crazy, right? I don't remember what the exact numbers are. I know Siva knows them, but something to like the very first implication of ChatGPT to the general public and how many dimensions it could look at versus how many it is now, it's like mind blowing, right? In the new ChatGPT 4 versus the very first installment of it. And that's just in the course of basically a year, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Barely a year and a half. Yeah.
So that's wild. But again, I want to go back again to the point that you were making of it's kind of like the tip of the iceberg, though, in the sense is like that's what we're seeing, but there was so much underneath that was happening. And I also wanted to go back to, you were kind of talking about the example of the like Stitch online
Stitch Fix. Yeah.
Stitch Fix. Yeah. The retailer. And so, I mean, some of this stuff has been crudely used quite successfly, I would argue, even back then, right? I mean, I'm probably one of those people that probably should have signed up for something like that.
How do you think I know about it?
Like my poor wife, I either live in a Typhoon t-shirt and like Nike basketball shorts, or I don't know about that. So,
yeah. Half my wardrobe is just full of swag.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like,
but so there's been lots of examples. And I think that brings us back to the point of, so this has been happening a lot longer than I think the general public really even talks about. And to be fair, I think this has even been going on a lot longer than a lot of technology folks in specific industries have really been talking about. And I absolutely think that banking is one of those, right? Banking is one of those industries where, in my humble opinion, and just the interactions that I've had, and I group myself in this same group too, right? Where we think that like AI kind of came out of nowhere. And in all reality, it didn't. Right. Like we've been working on this for a very, very long time, but it hit our radar very aggressively recently when things like ChatGPT came out and everybody started freaking out going, is this thing going to take my job? And on top of that, okay, so this thing is out there. How do I need to be using it in my industry? And again, that brings us back to the point of the use cases, right? And how do you start to identify what are the use cases that I can use this for? And you were alluding to some really simple examples, right? Of even just being able to understand, okay, if Josh calls into, Alaska Airlines and is saying, it's a problem that my flight is delayed. What's the underlying thing that he's trying to communicate? Well, he's trying to get from Chicago to Portland as quick as possible so he can help put his kids to bed, right? How do we identify that? And then very quickly search a database of potential flight options that he would be able to qualify for, and what's the quickest way that we can get him home. And so as you started to talk about some of the use case examples, that also opens up the next can of worms that I'd love to get your perspective on, which is this is only as good as the data that's in there, right? And then it's only as good as the data that's in there, but then it's also getting lots of new good data as it's going through its processes too, right? So then how are you running analytics on that to take the next level up of intelligence and, further that use case? So, you were talking about just one of the big catalysts for being able to make something like ChatGPT more prevalent is just it being able to be fed with data. Right? Being able to be fed with all of this information. Again, I think that's a whole other podcast of how that was done and who's getting sued over what. And, but let's just park that to the side. But it's you've got to feed it with good data, right? So if I call Alaska Airlines and I'm trying to get home as fast as possible, and all they can do is look at a very simple set of, Alaska flights that go directly from Chicago to Portland versus, being able to very quickly search every single flight, whatever. I'm using this is probably a rudimentary example to you, but it makes sense to me, but it needs all that data in there. It needs all of that information, but then its skill set is to be able to go over that in, like you said, a multi-dimensional approach versus just a matching approach of like a Google search, or like the old school days of maybe like a Travelocity or something. It's being able to really look at this multidimensional and then, be able to look at more scenarios the way a human would, but with more knowledge and faster processing power than a human would. Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really one of those things that's so difficult to pin down, partly because hey, we're still kind of putting it to or even putting it to use and learning ourselves, right? But in effect, yes, that's exactly how it is. I mean, even going back to the example that you were talking about, the key thing being data, right? I think right before in the beginning when we started talking, I was touching upon how over the last what 25, 20, 23, 25 years, banks, let's just take banks in particular, have been going through this digital journey, right? In some shape or form. It was first to, hey, automate the core system, the back office, hey, ledgers and making sure that everything reconciles, all of that, to then started going to, okay, well, that was the brain, but then how do I build muscles so that the rest of the body, which is all the operations, the function, productivity gain, bringing in efficiency in processes, all of that happen. And then, of course, the last phase being, okay, wait a second, we're making all this digital, but we forgot the customer. We forgot the customer or the member. And now we need to make sure that we improve their experience, right? So that whole journey evolution we've gone through. And on the surface, I think we've done a fairly good job, but there's still a few things that are good to call out. So first and foremost, I think along the way, it became a couple of things, right? What didn't necessarily happen, or well, what didn't necessarily happen as pervasively as it could have is while digital and digitization and automation happened, but it was in a lot of ways, it was, hey, what do I do today? How much of that is paper and how can I make it digital? Right. So, and don't get me wrong, that was great because at least you were creating the data footprint that then the future of innovation can take advantage of, but you're still kind of leaving a lot of the benefits on the table, right? So what's really happening now is going back to your question of use cases. What is the application? Where does this become real? Especially in a bank, in an enterprise, small or big for that matter, is the ability to reimagine workflows, reimagine processes, reimagine ways of doing work, right? So let's just take this example, classic one. So everything's digital, but everything's still some form driven or, whether it's paper or online, right? Now, ultimately, what has digital done? It's taking something from one stage from one human to another, to another, to another. And then once it reaches enough context and knowledge, maybe it goes to an AI model or a predictive model and out comes the output, right? But let's take that hopping from one human to another, right? Passing along the work as an example. So what's happening there and why was that the case? And how is Gen AI changing that? So loan applications, mortgage. I've worked for a company that used to help a bunch of banks manage just a document submitted during these application processes. And man, that's all they did, right? Just manage. It's a document repository, couple of $1 billion of valuation. But the challenge all was somebody still got to read it because a lot of them were faxed or scanned or sometimes, poor quality, some handwritten stuff, different formats, all of that. Now, OCR came along. OCR helped quite a bit, but we all know the challenges of OCR. It's great when it's very specific, but sucks at being generic. So,
Sorry,
so,
would you
uh,
just
yeah, go ahead.
for people listening, would you mind describing that a little bit more? So
Yeah,
dive a little bit more into what OCR is. What does it mean?
yeah,
What are the
sure.
challenges with it? Because I think that's a part of this equation.
No, absolutely. Yeah. The OCR, optical character recognition, right? It's an offshoot of the computer vision space, but essentially humans are great. And this is the real paradigm shift, right? So I'm glad you even pointed this out. But what seems exceedingly simple to us sometimes, whether it, you look at a form, you can read it, you can understand it, grok it, you can see what's the question, which is, hey, name, phone, address, all of it. You can see, decipher what the responses or the stuff that was filled out was. But put that in front of a computer that's never seen that before, as dumb as it may sound sometimes, it's extremely difficult for that machine to comprehend all of that, right? So this is that whole last frontier of unstructured data that's out there, which there's an insane amount of unstructured data out there, orders of magnitude more than even structured data within a bank, right? Just imagine all these forms, applications, everything that are just stored away in these repositories.
Yeah, sorry,
So
Shekhar. See, this is where, so now you're talking like, so now you're becoming the human that thinks it's so easy for the rest of us because it's easy for you. So when you talk about that, like, so what's the difference between structured and unstructured?
absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so great question. So structured data. It's essentially in the sense, so anybody who's worked with Excel, right? Now, most people have played around with Excel. If you've ever done budgeting or something, you categorize your expenses, right? So there's usually, okay, you'll create a table, it'll have, okay, so the date of expense, the type of expense, the category, and some description around it. Let's just take a simple example, right? Now, you would create a table where the headers would be there, right? So the date, the category, and the description. And then the rows would just be the values, right? The actual things that you fill up in the cells. Now, that's a great example of structured data because, anytime you look at a cell, you can triangulate and say, hey, what was this? Oh, it was the date of purchase, right? Just it's very descriptive, it's very specific in nature, and you won't find the description of the purchase in the date of purchase unless, something went horribly wrong somewhere. So that's very structured. That's easy to understand, not just for us, but most importantly for computers, right? Because that's where they can now say, hey, I can do math all around humans for all of this data because they understand what it was. They can calculate the differences between two dates super quick. What was the minimum purchase price, maximum purchase price, most expensive thing, average, all of this stuff becomes so easy. But now suddenly, if I just typed up, let's just say I did something like, oh yeah, great examples. Now, credit card statements. Why don't we use this, same or similar paradigm? Credit card statements, credit card, one thing that I'm almost sure is universally hated is how concise those descriptions becoming in the credit card statement. Sometimes you're like racking your brains on like,
Yeah.
wait, where did I spend this money? Right? What this makes
STBX
no
126943 XY.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then say, oh yeah, Walmart sometimes becomes WMRT, WLMRT, all kinds of stuff happens, right? So now if you take a credit card statement and you tell a computer, hey, just like that budget Excel that we built, now go populate the budget Excel automatically. Okay, it knows what it needs to store it in, but when it looks at that credit card statement, all of that information is in there, right? There's a purchase price, there's a date, there's a description, there's due dates of when you have to make payments, all of it's there. But it's all unstructured, as there's no fixed format to it, right? Chase Bank's credit card statement may be different from Bank of America. Now, even they may and it could be different from Amex, and each of them may keep changing it every few months to, add a little bit information, take away some information, stuff like that. So there's no fixed format. There's no fixed way of representing that. So that falls more in the unstructured space, right? So So the last frontier from a digital data perspective has been, how do you handle unstructured data at scale? How do you understand it? Or actually, how do you read it first, right? So let's just say read it. Read being, okay, this particular area is talking about the purchase price. This is talking about the description, so on and so forth. Then once you read it, understand it, and then use it just like any other structured data. It's a problem, and that I've been on both sides of solving and also experiencing for the last decade and a half. And it's only now, it's only now that I'm seeing solutions that are getting really good at solving that problem are becoming commonplace, right? I think in a couple of years, this will become a lot better. But whether it's the hyperscalers like the cloud providers, AWS, Google, Microsoft Azure, everybody has services that make the reading and comprehension of unstructured data a lot easier than what it used to be even 3 years ago. And lo behold, GenAI has a key, part to play there, because it's also making a lot of this stuff easier to understand.
And so, what's the role of, you were talking about kind of the challenge of OCR and
Mhm.
layering the challenge of OCR with the challenge of structured versus unstructured data. So, how is that changing?
Yeah. So we were talking about that loan process, right? So now the challenge was to automate it. That in the digital, era, all it meant was I'll scan it, I'll store it in some place, and whenever a loan officer or a processor, whoever it is, underwriter in some instances, comes in, they'll get, either a web page or something where they can then see the details of the application and all these documents that were submitted, right? But what were they doing? They were still reading all of that, right? They couldn't, I mean, the technology wasn't giving them, oh, by the way, so and so person has XYZ in asset. Oh, by the way, we looked at all of their credit card stuff and they have so much debt. Ultimately, biggest input into the ability to pay back loans is, what's your income? What's your debt, right? So people had to go read through that, extract all that information. Somebody sometimes even did manual data entry. So people would come in and look at those things because underwriters, loan officers were very expensive, right? So somebody who was maybe, an intern or a bunch of other folks would come in and digitize and extract all the information. So this is where the whole back office from a BPO perspective and all of it went through the roof, because somebody ultimately needed to look at this and read it and then create a structured representation of all. So that's the past though, right? Now, what's possible today? What's happening today? Today, two things have happened. Now, OCR has been supplanted with a lot of machine learning models, which have become really good at detecting because there's so much written content out there, right? Ultimately, machines, they only learn from whatever's out there and whatever's being fed to them as quote unquote training data, right? When machines are taught to do something, building models, they're fed in training data. So there's so much labeled training data wherein we say, okay, this squiggle is a 6, that squiggle is a 7. And when you give thousands of those examples to these machines, and to these the algorithms, they actually then become really good at detecting what's a 6 versus a 7. Sometimes, as I mentioned in the translate example, even better than humans, right? So that's where the first huge application of neural networks and all of that, all of those techniques came about, right? So what's happened is the ability to read these documents has improved, but then the ability to comprehend them too. So that aspect of, once you read all this, then saying, oh, which of this is an asset, which of this is a liability, which of this, have there been defaults, have there been missed payments? These are the things that an underwriter or a loan officer is, almost asking these questions or trying to get answers to these questions to feed into a math model or whatever to come up with a decision of yay or nay, right? So now not only are you able to better read that document by virtue of machine learning, by virtue of all of these models that recognize handwriting or forms, now you're also able to answer these questions. You're able to understand the data. So that's the shift, and it's a real use case of a few of folks that I work with, a bunch of others in the industry. There's tons of people who are helping out banks, insurance companies, a lot of companies actually automate and take these workflows, which were heavily human oriented, and almost acting like a co-pilot to them, right? You're never getting rid of the human, right? That's the other myth that I just want to dispel. You're making them do what they're doing in a lot more productive fashion, in a lot faster. But ultimately, you're never getting rid of the human for the foreseeable future.
Talking about use cases of that technology, you may or may not have better insight into this than I do. But I'll tell you what, have you ever used the software Expensify?
Yeah.
So
For 10
Expensify
9, 10 years. Yeah.
is one of those. I've
Receipt,
made the joke.
receipt scanning.
I've made the joke. Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Expensify is an expense tool that's everything from it actually, can take the picture of your receipt, or you can upload it in, to creating the expense report, to pushing it to your accounting team, reviewal processes, like that whole 9 yards. But what's really special about it, and I've joked internally at Typo, and I'm like, having Expensify as a retention tool for me as an employee. Like, I would never leave, just from the standpoint that I would never want to go to a company that didn't use Expensify for my expense reports, because it does such a phenomenal job. And I've been using it for a few years now, and just consistently blown away at how well it can take such a crazy wide range of different form factors of receipts I put into it. Everything from handwritten notes to, PDF folios from, hotels, to a receipt at a restaurant where you cross out the number because you did the math wrong for the tip and then put a new one in. And it takes all of that out, automatically fills out your expense report. And it is wildly rare how often it gets it wrong. Although the best one I've ever had it get wrong once, Shekhar, I thought was pretty funny. I bought like an iPad for work for us to use at like a trade show or something, just at an Apple store, and got the Apple receipt digitally, right? So it's super nice, clean digital, uploaded it into Expensify. What's an iPad? A couple $100, right? But it auto-filled my amount as like $6 trillion reimbursable. And I was like, oh, absolutely. That is correct. Yes, Expensify, please back me up. I deserve $6 trillion reimbursed, please, Typhoon.
That's the bug you were hoping for all your life.
Yeah, that's the bug I was hoping for this whole time. Yeah. But in all seriousness, it's absolutely phenomenal at how good it is at reading all of my chicken scratch to, more structured data. So I think that's just, I use that as an example of, I think a lot of times too, we're even interacting with some of this technology without even realizing it, but it's finding the right use case. And then not just saying like, this one thing is going to solve all the problems for all the use cases. And I know if you've heard me talk about this, topic on the podcast before, I'm probably overbeating this topic, but I think it's so true, right? That we need to understand that some of this new technology is absolutely a cheat code. This is a cheat code for the video game, and if you're not using it, you're losing, right? But at the same time, you have to know how to apply it, right? And so saying like the car is a cheat code, well, yeah, the car is a cheat code if you have, say, a delivery business, right? So it may revolutionize how your, pizza restaurant is able to deliver more product using the car faster. But if you're saying like, I'm going to use the car to make more pizzas, it's not a great tool for that, right? But it is a great tool for delivering the pizzas. And so if you're, Pizza Hut and you're using horse and buggy to deliver pizzas and Domino's is using cars, like Domino's just is going to sell more pizzas, right? But if all of a sudden Pizza Hut is like, well, we're going to use cars like Domino's, but we're going to use them to make pizzas, like,
Yeah.
they ain't going to work out so well. So it's finding the right use case and applying it. But this is kind of the cheat code of our era, right?
It truly is. And there's so many things that I just want to parse out of what you said, because there's a couple of things I was going to refer to too. So first and foremost, I think it's a combination of two pieces, right? One is value. So make sure you're understanding where the value is, right? The opportunity, the potential, all of it. Forget the technology. So for a bit, and I know places where they've said, oh, I have 180 use cases I can apply. I can apply this technology to, which is great. But where do you start, right? And no company, with even the biggest ones out there, just don't have enough talent to go after all this. I mean, forget talent. Even if they have talent, that talent does not have enough know-how yet being the keyword, because we're still, early days, right? The best practices, the shared, the mind share, the knowledge has just not kind of trickled down or gone across the board. So first and foremost, you got to focus on where the value is. And second, to your point, make sure that you're, not using this as the everything looks like a nail because I have a hammer, that cliche. But nobody knows that very well, right? Where I see the best of companies that succeed at this are like, okay, I understand enough of this, but I acknowledge that I don't know it all. And hence, what we'll do is we'll now get into this experimentation phase, the rapid iteration, not to actually say, hey, we've solved a problem, right? You actually want to fail 10 times because that helps you learn as to what's good, what's not good. That's where companies that have that mindset, have that ability to change and adapt, are the ones that are really already churning out some value and realizing some of the value from tech like this, right? I think this applies in general to any innovation or tech, but specifically here, just because there's such little understanding and common knowledge, that's the one benefit I see. Now, I just want to go back to your Expensify example. That's a classic. That's a great place where it brings together those couple of foundational bits that I was talking about. What does Expensify didn't do this on day one, right? They did this over the last few years, but what preceded it? Going back to your question, what was all this built upon? They had, for thousands and thousands of companies, for almost 5 to 6 plus years, they had millions of receipts that people would upload the receipts as evidence. So first ingredient, check, which is, hey, tons of data, right? Second ingredient, they actually did all the hard work for somebody, a huge team to go through and like classify, identify, categorize, painstakingly say, oh yeah, this is the store name in the receipt. This is the date of purchase, amount, all of that stuff. Somebody did all that hard work. And then they just threw these algorithms and compute at it, right? And with enough confluence of all these things, that's when you saw it kept on getting better every, quarter. I still remember emails from the Expensify CEO. He sends out these really nice emails talking about the product. I don't know
Yeah, he
if you
does.
ever, yeah, saw one. And but that's where innovation techniques plus all the hard work of bringing the data together and making it useful. That's when real value comes together. The last,
We oh, go
actually,
ahead.
another thing, going back to, you talked about, the Pizza Hut using the, cars for something that, for making pizzas, or somebody delivering using horse buggies. The other aspect, it's a little bit of a leap, but one of the key things, everybody talks tech, and for a while, tech is probably the easier part. We're all human. So bring together our strengths. we bring our strengths to the table, but we also have our weaknesses or biases and emotional, side to this. One of the biggest concern everybody has is like, okay, what's it going to do to my job, right? Am I going to be out of work? What's going to happen? So, and it's of course not a pretty conversation, because in the past when this used to come up, right, everybody's been through the industrial age, even so many of the manufacturing work going offshore, so tons of transitions, but it's not like we got out of work. But these things didn't happen overnight. They happened over a period of, 10, 15, 20 years sometimes. What's scary, I think, from all of this is just how quickly some of these things are going to happen. So going back, two aspects, right? One, for anybody who's listening, I think especially if you're early in your career, right? The as much as it's about picking skills up, it's also knowing which skills will still be valid and, like still not be commoditized by all this tech versus which ones will be, and making sure you're also orienting yourselves to pick those up, right? Because that's a key aspect. Now, I don't want to make this a lot more about, hey, what's the future of work, what's gonna happen, all of that. But the other aspect is also, I've seen a lot of concern from everybody saying, is this gonna make us, lazy or dumb or whatever, right? I mean, how long ago was it that people had to remember phone numbers, recipes, whatever it was? Who does that anymore? I mean, I still remember a few, but not more than three or four, right? So why is that? But has it made us any worse off? No, we still adapt to how things are. So that's the other aspect of, we shouldn't be concerned around the whole piece of, is this going to make us worse off and machines are going to take over? No. Yes, in certain instances, we will probably fall behind a little bit, but human ingenuity is always going to trump everything else. At least that's how I see it, or I'm a big believer of that.
I'm really glad you kind of brought up this part too, because as you were talking about just some of the different examples of how, especially in banking and finance, these tools are getting leveraged. It was interesting when you were talking about the whole Stitch Fix thing. One of the things that I was thinking about was, let's say Stitch Fix gets it wrong and they send
Mhm.
me something that I would just never in a million years wear. Like, meh, no harm, no foul, right? Especially if it's only one out of a bunch. And I'm like, you know what? They got it wrong once, whatever. They have a good return policy. I send it back. No big deal. Right. But what happens if my bank or credit union, for example, starts to leverage this technology and says, oh, Josh, we think actually you should drain your entire checking and savings account and put it in this 12-month CD because you'd make more money than you are today. That maths. And then all of a sudden my mortgage comes due and I have no money to pay my mortgage. And I'm not getting paid again until after my mortgage is due. And now my mortgage is late, or I have to take penalties on withdrawing that CD, right? That was bad advice. That was harmful advice, right? And then as we start to look at, like you were using the example of loan underwriting, right?
Mhm.
There's absolutely human bias that is done today, but there's also really great humans that are doing that today. And
Yep.
so how do we have an AI model that does a better job of removing biases and being truly objective about, is this a loan that we should fund and underwrite, yes or no? But at the same time, if whoever writes that program does a perfect job and it is absolutely flawless, except it hates everyone with the name Josh and just automatically denies them because they suck, now you've got another problem, right? As soon as we figure that out, us Joshes, man, we're rising up. Class action lawsuit coming your way. So I think there's also some both excitement and fear, especially in the banking space, around those tools, just from those two standpoints as well. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is so spot on. But at the same time, this isn't new, right? So I'll take the example of, I won't take names, but in a past life, worked with the top four bank in the US, all of it, till even a few years ago. So obviously, first and foremost, two concerns, right? Banks are heavily regulated. So something that we don't appreciate on a daily basis, but the amount of compliance and regulatory checks, and every time you're, especially when you're, making decisions of credit or loan or any of that kind of stuff where you could be denying somebody. So just tons of regulations around fair lending. Obviously, it was concerned when all this AI models, predictive models, machine learning models came about, and they said, okay, instead of your models that were built in a more traditional fashion by your stats people, by your risk folks, and everybody who ultimately then gave this very descriptive, if this, then that kind of a thought process, to now a machine just learning what's good and bad from past behavior, right? Which is awesome, but past what's defined and encoded in the past behavior could have biases, right? So us as humans could be feeding it something that is not the best representation of reality, or worse, is not a fair representation, because it one more about profit and loss, the other one's more about regulatory challenges. So I think all of that still holds true, and that's where, going back to the use case, one of the key things is any enterprise has to look at a multitude of dimensions and define those dimensions as being the key parameters on which it would evaluate the use case, right? So one of them I already mentioned, what's the value, what's the benefit? But then the flip side is, what's the risk? Is there risk from a customer experience perspective? I don't know if you ever saw that chatbot that Chevrolet had put up on their website, where it was,
Uh-uh.
yeah, these are the early days of, sometime early to mid last year. Everybody was coming up with chat GPT backed chatbots. But then all it did was you could type in any prompt as an end user, right? So I could go to Chevrolet.com, type in a prompt, and then it would, spit out whatever chat GPT knew, right? Not Chevrolet's point of view, but chat GPT's point of view. So some folks took screenshots, and it became a craze on Twitter too, or I guess X today, where somebody said, "Hey, tell me how Tesla is better than Chevrolet." And this is on a Chevrolet.com, right? I mean, on their property,
Whoops.
and like screenshots after screenshots after screenshots flooding the internet. Now, okay, hiccups like this happen. You've heard, so that's still okay, not as harmful, but you've heard of the Microsoft bot, which had a huge racial bias, and when it was turned on, it started, it just,
Yeah.
the quickest thing it learned was abusing language, because the
Yeah.
internet is so full of it.
Yeah, we humans are kind of shitty sometimes.
Uh,
And it
or,
picked
or
up on that real quick.
exactly, right? I mean, maybe somebody just fed it a bunch of YouTube comments, because that's like as bad as it gets, right? But it just goes back to that aspect of, what's the risk? You really have to put an insane amount of thought into what's the risk, what's the exposure, what if something goes wrong, who is getting impacted, how do you address it? So that's why everybody, I think, is still, while they're looking for extracting that value, but they're also kind of playing it safe in some ways by
That makes
making
sense.
sure that, there's a human in the loop, there's somebody to review, there's somebody to kind of, to your point, be that gating function so that nothing bad happens. While techniques are improving so that stuff like that doesn't happen automatically, there's lots of research around guardrails, all of it. But ultimately, right now, that is still, human in the loop is still king.
Well, I think that's a good point too, in that probably especially in banking, right? There's a wide spectrum of the risk versus reward. And in some
Mhm.
things, we may be able to be, the perceived risk of something going wrong is lower, right? I don't know, just trying to think of an example of, asking somebody where the nearest branch is, and they send me to one that's 2 miles away versus one that's 1.9 miles away. Like, the risk is pretty low, right? But the risk of, overwriting all of our core data, for example, would probably be a very high
Yeah.
risk. And so there are certain things where our risk tolerance is a complete and utter zero. There's zero that we can accept. And so that's probably going to be a really long tail of having things like AI participate in those, because the risk tolerance is zero. Like, we cannot
Yeah.
have a screw up, right? At the same time, well, with that scenario, if humans are involved, there's always risk involved because we're not perfect either. But you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But
We always hold
when,
machines to higher standards than we hold ourselves.
well, and two, I think there's the whole other conversation of, like, if it screws up, who's liable, right? And so, but at the same time, there's probably things within financial institutions where we're like, you know what, the risk isn't zero. Like, we can accept a little bit of risk here. So to your point, like, we can start to dabble, we can start to do things. One other thing that you brought up that I don't know if I'd ever really thought about until you were talking about, and I'd love to get your take on, is you were talking about one of the other challenges and why this technology had not become quite so pervasive was that it was compute hungry, right? And it takes up a lot of resources. And, I think we're seeing that in everything from things like Bitcoin mining to, the energy it takes to run a supercomputer. I think we're also at an interesting intersection of, we're trying to be hopefully a lot better about how we take care of this big, rock that we all live on that's hurtling around in space. We kind of only get one, right? Unless Elon figures out the whole Mars thing. But I think at least in our lifetime, like, I'm stuck with this one. So I kind of want to treat it pretty well, right? So we're trying to get better about treating this whole rock we're on a little bit better. And at the same time, we're starting to do these things that are incredibly energy intensive. Is there a mix of desires in that from your perspective, Shekhar? Like, is this going to be something where we're also going to run into just the limitations of, we're using more power than we really should to be doing some of these things? I don't know.
So I think there's a short-term answer and there's a, longer term answer, right? So in the short term, it definitely, and this is where I'm seeing it daily, increasingly, right? The ROI, what's unknown till you do, I don't know, a few dozen of these at a dozen places. It's very difficult to articulate. Okay, I'm putting in all this money to build this use case. What's the ROI? But ROI is two things. One is whatever effort, money went into building it, but also what's going into running it, keeping it running, right? So to your point, and that's not cheap. I've seen some numbers and woof, it's like it's more capital investment than what technology teams have done for a long time. Ever since you moved to the cloud, CapEx has reduced a lot, right? It's gone into the OpEx mode. So, but the bills here can run up real quick if you don't know what you're doing, if you aren't careful. So that's one aspect of, your question, right? But the other aspect, in the short term, it is expensive. It is energy hungry, which means there is not all of the energy powering all this is clean right now or green. So there is going to be a carbon footprint. But I think we are also, like it or not, we have kind of jumped onto on the back of a tiger, and we're just going to run with it. But where I am bullish and I see is a few things, two or three which are relatively close to the ground and one which is out there. So first and foremost, part of the reason why, and this is going to be slightly controversial, but I, I do think, and most people will probably over a period of time agree, is first and foremost, the models themselves are still very inefficient, right? Now, by virtue of the way they're built or by the virtue of the way they're used, or sometimes both, but they are, right? It takes this, remember, this it's still very early days in terms of like everybody's focused more on like, how do I even build one, to now the focus is shifting to how do I make sure that these things are actually used, right? And used effectively, price point is reducing, all of that. So that's first. The second thing is, I mean, while there's a reason why Nvidia hit three trillion dollar valuation, and it's great for everybody's stock portfolio. But two things, right? The competitions, Nvidia has always been good at staying ahead. But in general, there is going to be some competition that will help bring down the pricing too, right? Two things, because it's just any place where there's so much money and given capitalism, ultimately it does tend to, it may not, it may not bring down the price by 10 times, but it will come down quite a bit. And this is more the 18 to, 48-month timeline, right? For the next 9 to 18 months, I think we're still going to be in that space where slight reduction in cost every quarter, but not huge reduction in cost. And the third part, which is really out there, which probably is still, now I know everybody said that over the last 50 years, nuclear fusion has been 30 years away. But I think that, so to your point, yes, I don't think there's a ceiling, but the cost of energy and the cost of a lot of these investments is going to throttle where all you apply this for a few years. But by virtue of price points coming down, and I'm a huge believer in, like, okay, we are again probably 2 decades away from a decade and a half to 2 decades away from something like nuclear fusion. And once that happens, now just imagine, right? The biggest roadblock that you had, it's just unleashed. So again, that's for more of a much deeper, different conversation. But I do think that over a period of time, all of this is going to come down initially slowly, but eventually significantly.
I mean, I'm just the, non-techie over here, but I feel like, have we not just asked ChatGPT, hey, figure out a way to power yourself with green energy? Like, come on, is that not the solution here or what?
Well, unfortunately, it only can ultimately learn from what we've taught it, right? Otherwise, it just, see, the thing is, it'll give you a perfectly good answer. And this is important. I'm glad we came about to this in a different way. Part of that reason why that whole risk thing, all of it, right? It's why are we not going to apply over a period of time? I've heard from so many people, oh, why don't we use Chat GPT and Gen AI to do this? No, you cannot, because it's still non-deterministic, right? In the sense that everything else about computers so far, you tell it X, and X plus Y is always going to be Z if that's how you taught it. But here, I'm sure folks have heard the term hallucination, but for anybody who has not, it's it's the instance where you ask ChatGPT something, and in a bunch of instances, it will give you back an answer which is based on truth, but it will happily, without batting an eyelid, assuming it had a personality, or give you an entirely made up and incorrect answer, right? So that's the other thing. Risk, from a risk perspective, or as we as professionals and users get better, it's also having an appreciation for where to apply this kind of stuff versus not. Because anywhere where even there's that 0% tolerance to hallucination or stuff like that, you just cannot go there, right? Just imagine if you lied to or presented a incorrect, made up answer to one of your customers when they are on a critical call. The risk is too high. So that's why for the foreseeable future, we are still going to govern and gate all the output for all of this tech.
I mean, this is fascinating stuff. I think now I want to run this episode and all my episodes through an AI tool to tell me how much I talk versus my guests, because I'm pretty sure you're going to take the cake. I think we've recorded now over an hour and a half, and I think excluding your intro, I think I've maybe talked 4 minutes this whole time. This has been fascinating. That's a good thing, by the way.
Well, I was worried if you would even go to 30 minutes.
Yeah. No, I'm like, it's just, I think that's what's so cool. This is what I've loved about the podcast is like getting people on who are so deeply passionate and like educated on their subject matter. I mean, you virtually needed nothing from me and just wrote your own whole episode on our conversation today. I mean, it's just fascinating. But Shekhar, before I end the podcast, I definitely have to ask this question of you because I'm genuinely very curious now. Where do you go to get information? Like what kind of stuff do you pay attention to?
Ooh. Uh, so there's different kinds, and there's no one source. But so one thing I worked over the years is on my Google pool. I can I can out search the other. That's probably the one skill I have better than most folks I know, which is probably what keeps me going. Right, allows me to fake it. But that's one thing, because especially in a lot of instances, when you're working with such a wide spectrum of stuff, it's not easy to just always go to two or three authoritative sources, right? I mean, you won't have that. So that's one. But at the same time, there's, especially for a lot of the technical stuff, I do a lot of Medium blogs, follow a bunch, but there's a couple of websites which I recommend anybody who's in the tech space, especially, software programming, architecture, things like that. There's infoq.com, there's gayzone.com. Another place that I love, and this is where I pick up trends and what's good, what's upcoming, what's actually materializing fairly well, is there's this company called ThoughtWorks. A few folks may have heard of it, but they're like another technology consulting company. They Every quarter they release a tech radar. Right? So anybody who's interested in trends specifically around technology in the, the software engineering and associated realm should go look up the tech radar from ThoughtWorks. It's amazing presentation, amazing articulation. So that's another place that I go
I'll have to
to.
check that out.
Yeah, yeah. So highly recommend that.
Well, and if people want to connect with you or if they want to learn a little bit more about EXL Analytics, where and how can they do that?
Best place is LinkedIn. If you just type my name up there, and it's unique enough to pop up at the top. Just drop me a DM. I'm trying to get back into Twitter a little bit, but LinkedIn's the best pass. EXL, definitely hit up our website, exlservice.com. We do a lot of work at the intersection of, we have huge domain expertise in banking, insurance, some of these doing this for 15, 20, 25 years at the intersection of domain, data, and AI, right? So helping our customers essentially bring all this together and realize value. So look us up on exlservice.com.
Awesome. Hey, Shekhar, thank you so much for coming and just sharing so much knowledge with us. I feel like I've had lots of conversations about AI over the last handful of years. It's really picked up in the last little bit. I am absolutely walking away with, I think, a much better understanding. So I really appreciate you taking the time and coming and being a guest on the Digital Banking Podcast.
Thank you, Josh, for being so kind with your words. I have to say this was especially enjoyable. Thank you for making this, so easy and really, as we discussed, just a conversation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good luck to your future episodes too. Thanks again.
Well, they got a high bar to hold after this one, so.
Oh, you're too kind, sir.
No, seriously, I'm like, man, this is going to be one of those ones that my brain's going to hurt afterwards. We should have scheduled this later in the day for me so I can be done after this. No, seriously,
awesome.
Thank you again. This was a really, really phenomenally educational episode for me.
Thank you. I'm glad. Hopefully some of the audience finds it like that too. Thanks.
I'm sure they will.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Banking Podcast powered by Typho. Find more episodes on digitalbankingpodcast.com or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.